Hi guys. Let me begin that I'm not an expert, but I have helped probably hundreds of people over the years in getting their shows fixed or running while helping out in the Zoom room. So this information is based on my personal experience and the experience of those that I have helped. I am not a proponent of any one controller company, and I'll keep this unbiased and provide the facts as I know them. Do your own research, but be very careful in the source of the documentation and the date of the information. Controllers are constantly evolving and new controller companies are coming out. There is a vendor out there that has videos that compares their products to other people's products, but they provide false information and in many cases what I consider outright lies. So consider the source of your research. Before I tell you what the absolute best controller is, you need to have a general idea of what you want your show to look like. So lay out your show in X-Lights first. Get an estimate of the number of pixels in each model, the distance between the models, and the distance from potential controller locations. And that includes the distance from differential receivers, even though they're not technically a controller, but it's the distance from the port connection to the first pixel that matters. Location. You might have some security concerns that you want the controllers not to be, so that's something you need to take into consideration. Or if you are concerned that if you have a controller that has an Ethernet port on it, that someone can gain access to your network by sitting on your front yard with a laptop, then that's something to consider. Even though that is a very rare situation, that might be a concern for you. Resources. Where are you going to get power? Where are you going to run the cables? All of your devices are going to need power of some sort. Network connections. Where do you have access to the network? Wi-Fi. Are you going to have access to Wi-Fi if that's the choice that you want to do? Personal preferences. This is a big one. So wire runs. Are you going to run network cables, extension cords, etc. across sidewalks and driveways where they could be tripped on or damaged? Or do you want to run them across the eaves or over the roof? So that's something for you to think about how you want that to be done. Do you want a pre-built controller? If you get a pre-built controller, those are typically built generically and they might not be how you want your show to be designed, so you might have to modify it. Or if you don't want to modify your controller, you might have to design your show around the controller. But with JDation and Wired Watts having kits that make it real simple to build your own controller box, it's an option that you want to consider because it's really not that difficult. Then, are you going to do power injection? If you're totally against power injection, you might have to get a controller that's got more port options because you won't be able to string as many pixels per port. That's something that you need to take into consideration. Support options. If something goes wrong, how quickly and how good is the support that you can get? What happens if on Christmas Eve your show goes down because of some configuration design? Can you get help? Now the big one, moolah. Obviously you want it to be within your budget. This hobby shouldn't be a burden on you or your family. One thing that some people have done is to buy an inexpensive controller to start with, and then they plan on just purchasing more and more of these small controllers as they expand their show. In my opinion, that is not the best or most economical way to go. These small controllers are not very efficient, and maintaining a network when you get several of these small controllers can be troublesome for many. If you're using the Wi-Fi based controllers like the ESP Pixel Sticks, then it doesn't take too many of these devices on your network before you start having problems with your show. WLED based controllers typically cost around 2 cents per pixel capacity, but the mainstream controllers are less than half of that at less than 1 cent per pixel. So controllers are a big expense, but in my opinion, it's easier to buy a controller once at the beginning that will give you room to grow. That way future expansions won't require you to buy additional controllers. Then when you expand your show in the future, it will actually cost less because you won't be buying a controller and you'll only be buying the pixels and the props to go with it. But with that being said, bigger is better, right? Well, not really. I've seen a lot of people purchase the F48 because it was the biggest and baddest controller on the market. It can support 48 ports, so it must be the best, right? But once they got it, it really wasn't what they wanted. They didn't understand how that controller worked. They were able to get it to work, but with more headaches and costs than what they really needed. Don't get me wrong, the F48 is a great controller, but just because it sounds like the biggest and baddest doesn't make it the best for you. It is the best in some situations, but not all situations. Did you know that the F8B can actually be configured to control 80 ports? Something to think about. So there are some limitations in any show or controller configuration that you need to be aware of when you're designing your show in order to determine what the best controller is going to be. These are just guidelines, and people have experienced greater and lesser results, and that is because there are way too many variables involved, like controller, the pixel vendor, wire size, etc. So your mileage may vary. The limitations on any show design are the distance to the first pixel. Typically, from a controller to the first pixel is be no more than around 30 feet. If you get beyond 30 feet, or if based on your configuration you're starting to get data degradation, you can use an FAMP or a null pixel. FAMPs are far superior than a null pixel, and that can help you extend that distance, but not always. Distance between models. This is considered a pixel-to-pixel distance, and this is typically maxes out around 10 feet. Again, you can use an FAMP or null pixel to extend the distance, and it might or might not help. Number of pixels you want to do on each port. Now this is going to depend on if you're wanting to do power injection or not, and that's going to vary on how many you can get on there with before you need power injection, and that's going to depend on the pixels themselves, the wire gauge from the pixels to each other, and the wire gauge for the extension going to it, and the brightness that you're running. So there's no hard set number that you can do. Then you got physical capabilities. You might have some mobility or dexterity issues that's going to limit how you're going to design your show. You might not be able to get to certain points to put lights or install a controller. You might be colorblind. So if you're colorblind, it's going to be extremely difficult to make network cables. So you're either going to have someone help you, or buy cables that are extra long, or purchase custom cables, or do a show design that you don't need network cables at all. So there's really only two types of controllers, and I'm going to classify them based on the primary capabilities of the controller. But because there's so many variations, I'm going to actually group them a little different, and I'm going to cover them in this type of controller configuration. You have a local port, and this is where the pixels connect directly to the controller. Then you have a differential type controller, and that's where you have a controller that will send the data to a receiver, and that is where the pixels will connect. Then you have a hybrid, and that's where it's either primarily a local port or a differential type controller, but it has a limited capability of the opposite style. Then you have multisync. Multisync isn't really a controller type. It's more of a way that you could configure a local port type controller for broad type shows, and so I'm going to go over that as well. And then mixed. You can mix and match all of these controller types as you want. And as people expand their shows, a lot of times they will have some sort of mixed configuration. But I'd recommend starting off on a small, simple one at first. And then once you get that figured out, then you can expand. Okay, so these are some local port controllers. And you can see here, this is an F16 V4. This is a Culp K16AB. Hinx Pro, an ESP Pixel Sticks, and a SAN devices. Those are some common local port controllers that are around. The SAN devices I don't think is being made anymore, but there's still a lot of them floating around. So this is how a local port controller might look in a box. Here is my controller for my singing trees and singing faces for Halloween, and it's a 8-port controller. I'm only using 4 ports. I got power injection that I don't use, and it's in a small ammo box. Here's a backup controller that I have. Same thing, a K8 with the power supply. And here's a K16, I'm sorry, here's an F16 V3 that I use for all of my yard props, my mega tree and all the stuff props on the front yard. So that's how that might look. So this is kind of how it would look when you have it out there. You have the controller box, then you'll run the 3-core cable to each of your pixels, and you can chain them. And then you have 3 ports going to your Christmas tree and star. And then you have over here linked to some other devices. And if you recall, I mentioned that this distance from the controller to the first pixel usually is about 30 feet max. If you run into that and you need to boost the signal, you can use an F-amp or a null pixel. F-amps are far superior, and that'll a lot of times help you boost your signal to get a little bit more. The exact distance is going to depend on a lot of variables, so you really can't get an exact distance there. So here's some differential controllers. This controller is designed for use on widespread shows or where someone wants a centralized type of show. But that doesn't mean that if your models are not widespread, that this controller isn't the correct one for you. This is an F48V4, K40 DPB, the F48 original, and a HiggsPix Pro long-range transmitter. And a typical differential controller setup would be that you'd have the controller and you'd run a network cable over to a receiver. So the receivers are commonly called remotes, and there's 2 types of receivers. A normal receiver, which is sometimes referred to as a dumb receiver, and smart receivers. A normal or dumb receiver, you can only connect one output on each of these ports, so you can only have one receiver on a chain. A smart receiver is designed so that you could daisy chain them. And depending on the controller and the receivers, you can run up to 6 in a chain. But you cannot mix these in the chain. So you can't have a smart receiver and end with a dumb receiver. And you can use a smart receiver if you're only having one. You just set it into normal mode. And this is kind of what a differential controller might look like. So you'd have the controller running a network cable over to the receiver box, and then the receiver would plug into your props. Same thing here, you have this running over, 3 ports going over. Now here, this is a long run here, but the nice thing with the differential receivers is that this network run here can run 300 feet. So there's really no need for any type of booster. But once you get over here, if this distance from the port to the first pixel is excessively long and you're running into a data issue, you can run an F-amp or null pixel to do it. So there's a lot of things that are common with both, with all the different controllers. So if you've got a widespread yard or you want to put this in an isolated location, that's the type of controller you'll want to get. And here's an example of a hybrid controller. Many of the controllers on the market now have the ability to use local ports and differential receivers. The Culp controllers are a little better designed to use as a hybrid type controller, but the Falcon V4 series has closed that gap quite a bit. So you would have local ports that you run over to your props, and then if you have a prop that's quite a distance away that you might have a signal issue, you could run a differential receiver, and then you can control the props over there. Now, the Culps, they don't need any type of expansion board to do it. Some controllers will need some sort of expansion board to be able to expand it this way, but that's something that's going to depend on the controller that you get. Now, this is multi-sync. So this is how, if you had a widespread type yard, you would have it with a differential type controller. But if you want to go with multi-sync on a widespread display, it really simplifies things quite a bit. Because you don't need to have a centralized controller. Everything communicates via Wi-Fi. And it's a very efficient method because those data signals are very small. So, but the only thing is you will need to have a good Wi-Fi signal in the area that you're using, but it is a good, efficient method to use. It is a very common method as well. So here's my display, and my controller situation is way overkill. I could do my entire show probably with an F16, but my choice is not to. I've got an F16 V3 in my tree that controls the tree and the star. All of these trees, each of these trees have 100 pixels per tree, and the candy canes. Then I've got another small controller here, and it controls this half of the house. I've got a small controller hiding behind one of these trees that controls just the trees. Then I have another controller over here that controls this half of the house and these candy canes. And then I have a controller just for my Toon2 sign. I do have a separate controller for the matrix only because I wanted to use different voltage on that, but I could have run it from the same controller. It's about what makes best sense to you and ease of use. My show is modular. I can take it up and down in a very short period of time, so that works for me. Alrighty, it's decision time. You need to decide what type of controller configuration you want. Now, there is no best way here. It is totally personal preference. So pick one of the 4 methods that you want to primarily use, and that'll narrow down your choices. Keith Wesley did a very good review of the more common controllers, and I think his evaluation was pretty accurate. I don't agree with a couple of his numbers, but they're not that far off. I also have a video link below as well to go to that video if you want to see it. So once you've decided on the primary type of controller, now it is time for me to tell you what is the best controller for you. Here we are. The moment of truth. It's time for me to tell you what the absolute best controller is for you. The absolute best controller is the one that meets your needs and you understand and can make work. Hopefully now you have the information needed to pick what will be the best controller for you. Any of the controllers mentioned, even the small WLED based controllers, might be the best for you. As far as what vendor or controller is best, that is 100% personal choice. There is no best one. If there were, then there would only be one controller on the market because that's the only one that people would be buying. The best one is the one that is best for you. Asking what the best controller is asking like, what is better? Chevy or Ford, Windows or Mac, In-N-Out or Runza, or maybe Whataburger, who knows. But there are no 2 shows that are exactly alike, and everyone has different preferences and needs. What works best for someone else might not be the best for you. I would strongly suggest getting either a Culp or Falcon controller because there are far more support options when something isn't working correctly, and they're closely integrated with X-Lights, so almost all of your controller configurations can actually be done in X-Lights, and they've been around quite a while. The Hingspix controllers are good controllers as well, but they're a little more difficult to get configured correctly, and there aren't as many support options for it, and the support might take a little bit longer than what you want. But it is still a good choice. There are 2 different Hanson controllers out there that are both good choices as well. Those just research on the style that you want. So I put some links below for some other resources that might help, and I hope that this helps you decide what is the best controller. So with that being said, have a good day.